Liza of Lambeth, a novel by Somerset Maugham, Part 4, 9. Thus began a time of love and joy. As soon as her work was over and she had finished tea, Liza would slip out and at some appointed spot meet Jim. Usually it would be at the church, where the Westminster Bridge Road bends down to get to the river, and they would go off, arm in arm, till they came to some place where they could sit down and rest. Sometimes they would walk along the Albert Embankment to Battersea Park, and here sit on the benches, watching the children play. The female cyclist had almost abandoned Battersea for the parks on the other side of the river, but often enough one went by, and Liza, with the old-fashioned prejudice of her class, would look after the rider and make some remark about her, not seldom more forcible than ladylike. Both Jim and she liked children, and tiny, ragged urchins would gather round to have rides on the man's knees, or mock fights with Liza. They thought themselves far away from anyone in Vere Street, but twice, as they were walking along, they were met by people they knew. Once it was two workmen coming home from a job at Vauxhall. Liza did not see them till they were quite near. She immediately dropped Jim's arm, and they both cast their eyes to the ground as the men passed, like ostriches, expecting that if they did not look, they would not be seen. "Do you see 'em, Jim?" asked Liza, in a whisper, when they had gone by. "I wonder if they see us." Almost instinctively she turned round, and at the same moment one of the men turned too. Then there was no doubt about it. "That did give me a turn," she said. "So it did me," answered Jim. "I simply went 'ot all over." "We was bally fools," said Liza. "We ought to have spoken to 'em. Do you think they'll let H.T.?" They heard nothing of it. When Jim afterwards met one of the men in a public-house, he did not mention a meeting, and they thought that perhaps they had not been recognized. But the second time was worse. It was on the Albert Embankment again. They were met by a party of 4, all of whom lived in the street. Liza's heart sank within her, for there was no chance of escape. She thought of turning quickly and walking in the opposite direction, but there was not time, for the men had already seen them. She whispered to Jim, "Back us up," and as they met, she said to one of the men, "Ulloa there! Where are you off to?" The men stopped, and one of them asked the question back, "Where are you off to?" "Me? Oh, I've just been to the hospital. One of the gals at our place is queer, and so I says to myself, I'll go and see her." She faltered a little as she began, but quickly gathered herself together, lying fluently and without hesitation. "And when I come 8, she went on, "who should I see just passing the hospital but this here cove, and he says to me, 'What cheer,' says he, 'I'm going to Vauxhall, come and walk a bit of the Wye with us.' 'All right,' says I don't mind if I do." One man winked and another said, "Go it, Liza." She fired up with the dignity of outraged innocence. "What do you mean by that?" she said. "Do you think I'm kiddin'?" "Kiddin'? No. You've only just come up from the country, ain't you?" "Think I'm kidding? What do you think I want to kid for? Liars never believe anyone. That's fact." "Now then, Liza, don't be saucy." "Saucy? I'll smack you in the eye if you sigh much to me. Come on," she said to Jim, who had been standing sheepishly by, and they walked away. The men shouted, "Now we shan't be long," and went off laughing. After that, they decided to go where there was no chance at all of their being seen. They did not meet till they got over Westminster Bridge, and thence they made their way into the park. They would lie down on the grass in one another's arms, and thus spend the long summer evenings. After the heat of the day, there would be a gentle breeze in the park, and they would take in long breaths of the air. It seemed far away from London. It was so quiet and cool. And Liza, as she lay by Jim's side, felt her love for him overflowing to the rest of the world and enveloping mankind itself in a kind of grateful happiness. If it could only have lasted. They would stay and see the stars shine out dimly, one by one, from the blue sky, till it grew late and the blue darkened into black, and the stars glittered in thousands all above them. But as the nights grew cooler, they found it cold on the grass, and the time they had there seemed too short for the long journey they had to make. So, crossing the bridge as before, they strolled along the embankment till they came to a vacant bench, and there they would sit, with Liza nestling close up to her lover and his great arms around her. The rain of September made no difference to them. They went as usual to their seat beneath the trees, and Jim would take Liza on his knee and, opening his coat, shelter her with it, while she, with her arms round his neck, pressed very close to him and occasionally gave a little laugh of pleasure and delight. They hardly spoke at all through these evenings, for what had they to say to one another? Often, without exchanging a word, they would sit for an hour with their faces touching, the one feeling on his cheek the hot breath from the other's mouth, while at the end of the time the only motion was an upraising of Liza's lips, a bending down of Jim's, so that they might meet and kiss. Sometimes Liza fell into a light doze, and Jim would sit very still for fear of waking her, and when she roused herself, she would smile, while he bent down again and kissed her. They were very happy, but the hours passed by so quickly that Big Ben's striking 12 came upon them as a surprise, and unwillingly they got up and made their way homewards. Their partings were never ending. Each evening Jim refused to let her go from his arms, and tears stood in his eyes at the thought of the separation. "I'd give something," he would say, "if we could be together always." "Never mind, old chap," Liza would answer, herself half crying. "It can't be helped, so we must jolly well lump it." But notwithstanding all their precautions, people in Vere Street appeared to know. First of all, Liza noticed that the women did not seem quite so cordial as before, and she often fancied they were talking of her. When she passed by, they appeared to look at her, then say something or other, and perhaps burst out laughing. But when she approached, they would immediately stop speaking and keep silence in a rather awkward, constrained manner. For a long time, she was unwilling to believe that there was any change in them, and Jim, who had observed nothing, persuaded her that it was all fancy. But gradually it became clearer, and Jim had to agree with her that somehow or other people had found out. Once when Liza had been talking to Polly, Jim's daughter, Mrs. Blakeston, had called her, and when the girl had come to her mother, Liza saw that she spoke angrily, and they both looked across at her. When Liza caught Mrs. Blakeston's eye, she saw in her face a surly scowl, which almost frightened her. She wanted to brave it out, and stepped forward a little to go and speak with the woman. But Mrs. Blakeston, standing still, looked so angrily at her that she was afraid to. When she told Jim, his face grew dark, and he said, "Blast the woman! I'll give her what for if she says anything to you." "Don't strike her, whatever happens, will you, Jim?" said Liza. "She'd better take care then," he answered. And he told her that lately his wife had been sulking and not speaking to him. The previous night, on coming home after the day's work and bidding her good evening, she had turned her back on him without answering. "Can't you answer when you're spoke to?" he had said. "Good evening," she had replied sulkily, with her back still turned. After that, Liza noticed that Polly avoided her. "What's up, Polly?" she said to her one day. "You never speaks now. Have you had your tongue cut AHT?" "Me? I ain't got nothing to speak about that I knows of," answered Polly, abruptly walking off. Liza grew very red and quickly looked to see if anyone had noticed the incident. A couple of youths sitting on the pavement had seen it, and she saw them nudge one another and wink. Then the fellows about the street began to chaff her. "You look pale," said one of a group to her one day. "You're overworking yourself, you are," said another. "Married life don't agree with Liza, that's what it is," added a third. "Who do you think you're getting at?" "I ain't married, and never like to be," she answered. "Liza has all the pleasures of a husband and none of the trouble." Blime if I know what you mean, said Liza. Nah, of course not. You don't know nothing, do you? Innocent as a babe, our Father which art in heaven. Haven't been in London long, have you? They spoke in chorus, and Liza stood in front of them, bewildered, not knowing what to answer. Don't you make no mistake about it, Liza knows a thing or two. Oh, me darling, I love you fit to kill, but take care your missus ain't round the corner. This was particularly bold, and they all laughed. Liza felt very uncomfortable and fiddled about with her apron, wondering how she should get away. Take care you don't get into trouble, that's all, said one of the men, with burlesque gravity. You might give us a chance, Liza. You come AHT with me one evening. You ought to give us all a turn, just to show there's no ill feeling. Blime if I know what you're all talking about. You're all balmy on the crumpet, said Liza indignantly, and turning her back on them, made for home. Among other things that had happened was Sally's marriage. One Saturday, a little procession had started from Vere Street, consisting of Sally, in a state of giggling excitement, her fringe magnificent after a whole week of curling papers, clad in a perfectly new velveteen dress of the colour known as electric blue, and Harry, rather nervous and ill at ease in the unaccustomed restraint of a collar. These two walked arm in arm and were followed by Sally's mother and uncle, also arm in arm, and the procession was brought up by Harry's brother and a friend. They started with a flourish of trumpets and an old boot and walked down the middle of Vere Street, accompanied by the neighbours' good wishes. But as they got into the Westminster Bridge Road and nearer to the church, the happy couple grew silent, and Harry began to perspire freely, so that his collar gave him perfect torture. There was a public house just opposite the church, and it was suggested that they should have a drink before going in. As it was a solemn occasion, they went into the private bar, and there Sally's uncle, who was a man of means, ordered 6 pots of beer. "Feel a bit nervous, Harry?" asked his friend. "Nah," said Harry, as if he had been used to getting married every day of his life. "Bit warm, that's all." "Your very good health, Sally," said her mother, lifting her mug. "This is the last time as I shall ever address you as Miss." "And may she be as good a wife as you was," added Sally's uncle. "Well, I don't think my old man ever had no complaint to Mike about me. I did my duty by him, although it's me as says it," answered the good lady. "Well, mates," said Harry's brother, "I reckon it's about time to go in. So here's to the health of Mr. Henry Atkins and his future missus." "And God bless 'em," said Sally's mother. Then they went into the church, and as they solemnly walked up the aisle, a pale-faced young curate came out of the vestry and down to the bottom of the chancel. The beer had had a calming effect on their troubled minds, and both Harry and Sally began to think it rather a good joke. They smiled on each other, and at those parts of the service which they thought suggestive, violently nudged one another in the ribs. When the ring had to be produced, Harry fumbled about in different pockets, and his brother whispered, "Swap me Bob, he's gone and lost it." However, all went right, and Sally having carefully pocketed the certificate, they went out and had another drink to celebrate the happy event. In the evening, Liza and several friends came into the couple's room, which they had taken in the same house as Sally had lived in before, and drank the health of the bride and bridegroom till they thought fit to retire. 10. It was November. The fine weather had quite gone now, and with it much of the sweet pleasure of Jim and Liza's love. When they came out at night on the embankment, they found it cold and dreary. Sometimes a light fog covered the river banks and made the lamps glow out dim and large. A light rain would be falling, which sent a chill into their very souls. Foot passengers came along at rare intervals, holding up umbrellas and staring straight in front of them as they hurried along in the damp and cold. A cab would pass rapidly by, splashing up the mud on each side. The benches were deserted except perhaps for some poor homeless wretch who could afford no shelter and, huddled up in a corner with his head buried in his breast, was sleeping heavily like a dead man. The wet mud made Liza's skirts cling about her feet, and the damp would come in and chill her legs and creep up her body till she shivered, and for warmth pressed herself close against Jim. Sometimes they would go into the third-class waiting rooms at Waterloo or Charing Cross and sit there. But it was not like the park or the Embankment on summer nights. They had warmth, but the heat made their wet clothes steam and smell, and the gas flared in their eyes, and they hated the people perpetually coming in and out, opening the doors and letting in a blast of cold air. They hated the noise of the guards and porters shouting out the departure of the trains, the shrill whistling of the steam engine, the hurry and bustle and confusion. About 11 o'clock, when the trains grew less frequent, they got some quietness. But then their minds were troubled, and they felt heavy, sad, and miserable. One evening they had been sitting at Waterloo Station. It was foggy outside, a thick, yellow November fog which filled the waiting room, entering the lungs and making the mouth taste nasty and the eyes smart. It was about 11:30, and the station was unusually quiet. A few passengers in wraps and overcoats were walking to and fro, waiting for the last train, and one or two porters were standing about yawning. Liza and Jim had remained for an hour in perfect silence, filled with a gloomy unhappiness as of a great weight on their brains. Liza was sitting forward, with her elbows on her knees, resting her face on her hands. "I wish I was straight," she said at last, not looking up. "Well, why won't you come along of me altogether? And you'll be all right then," he answered. "Nah, that's no go. I can't do that." He had often asked her to live with him entirely, but she had always refused. "You can come along of me, and I'll take a room in a lodging house in Holloway, and we can live there as if we was married." "What about your work?" "I can get work over the other side as well as I can here. I'm about sick of the way things is going on." "So am I, but I can't leave Mother." "She can come too." "Not when I'm not married. I shouldn't like her to know as I'd gone wrong." "Well, I'll marry you. Swap me, Bob. I wants to badly enough." "You can't. You're married already." "That don't matter. If I give the missus so much a week AHT of my screw, she'll sign a paper to give up all climb to me, and then we can get spliced. One of the men as I works with done that, and it was a right." Liza shook her head. "Nah, you can't do that now. It's bigamy, and the cop takes you, and you gets 12 months hard for it." "But swap me, Bob, Liza. I can't go on like this. You knows the missus. Well, there ain't no bloomin' doubt about it. She knows as you and me are carrying on, and she makes no bones about letting me see it." "She don't do that." "Well, she don't exactly say it, but she sulks and won't speak. And then when I says anything, she rounds on me and calls me all the names she can think of. I'd give her a good hidin', but somehow I don't like her. She makes the place a hell to me, and I'm not going to stand it no longer." "You'll have to sit it then. You can't chuck it." "Use I can, and I would if you'd come along of me. I don't believe you like me at all, Liza, or you'd come." She turned towards him and put her arms round his neck. "You know I do, old cock," she said. "I like you better than anyone else in the world, but I can't go away and leave Mother. Blame me if I see why. She's never been much to you. She makes you slave away to pay the rent, and all the money she earns she boozes." "That's true. She ain't been what you might call a good mother to me, but somehow she's my mother, and I don't like to leave her on her own, now she's so old, and she can't do much with the rheumatics. And besides, Jim dear, it ain't only Mother, but there's your own kids. You can't leave them." He thought for a while and then said, "You're about right there, Liza. I don't know if I could get on without the kids. If I could only take them and you too swap me bob, I should be happy. Liza smiled sadly. So you see, Jim, we're in a bloomin' hole, and there ain't no way AHT of it that I can see. He took her on his knees and, pressing her to him, kissed her very long and very lovingly. Well, we must trust to luck, she said again. Perhaps something'll happen soon, and everything'll come right in the end, when we gets 4 balls of worsted for a penny. It was past 12, and separating, they went by different ways along the dreary, wet, deserted roads till they came to Vere Street. And the street seemed quite different to Liza from what it had been 3 months before. Tom, the humble adorer, had quite disappeared from her life. One day, 3 or 4 weeks after the August bank holiday, she saw him dawdling along the pavement, and it suddenly struck her that she had not seen him for a long time. But she had been so full of her happiness that she had been unable to think of anyone but Jim. She wondered at his absence, since before, wherever she had been, there was he certain to be also. She passed him, but to her astonishment, he did not speak to her. She thought by some wonder he had not seen her, but she felt his gaze resting upon her. She turned back, and suddenly he dropped his eyes and looked down, walking on as if he had not seen her, but blushing furiously. "Tom," she said, "why don't you speak to me?" He started and blushed more than ever. "I didn't know you was there," he stuttered. "Don't tell me," she said. "What's up?" "Nothing as I knows of," he answered uneasily. "I ain't offended you, have I, Tom?" "Nah, not as I knows of," he replied, looking very unhappy. "You don't ever come my way now," she said. "I didn't know as you wanted to see me." "Gone! You knows I likes you as well as anybody." "You're like so many people, Liza," he said, flushing. "What do you mean?" said Liza indignantly, but very red. She was afraid he knew now, and it was from him especially she would have been so glad to hide it. "Nothing," he answered. "One doesn't say things like that without any meaning, unless one's a blind fool." "You're right there, Liza," he answered. "I am a blind fool." He looked at her a little reproachfully, she thought, and then he said, "Goodbye," and turned away. At first she was horrified that he should know of her love for Jim, but then she did not care. After all, it was nobody's business, and what did anything matter as long as she loved Jim and Jim loved her? Then she grew angry that Tom should suspect her. He could know nothing but that some of the men had seen her with Jim near Vauxhall, and it seemed mean that he should condemn her for that. Thenceforward, when she ran against Tom, she cut him. He never tried to speak to her, but as she passed him, pretending to look in front of her, she could see that he always blushed, and she fancied his eyes were very sorrowful. Then several weeks went by, and as she began to feel more and more lonely in the street, she regretted the quarrel. She cried a little as she thought that she had lost his faithful, gentle love, and she would have much liked to be friends with him again. If he had only made some advance, she would have welcomed him so cordially, but she was too proud to go to him herself and beg him to forgive her. And then, how could he forgive her? She had lost Sally too, for on her marriage, Harry had made her give up the factory. He was a young man with principles worthy of a member of Parliament, and he had said, "A woman's place is her home, and if her old man can't afford to keep her without her working in a factory, well, all I can say is that he'd better go and get single." "Quite right, too," agreed his mother-in-law. "And what's more, she'll have a baby to look after soon, and that'll take her all her time. And there's no one as knows the better than me, for I've had 12, to say nothing of 2 stills and 1 miss." Liza quite envied Sally her happiness, for the bride was brimming over with song and laughter. Her happiness overwhelmed her. "I am happy," she said to Liza one day a few weeks after her marriage. "You don't know what a good sort Harry is. He's just a darling, and there's no mistaking it. I don't care what other people say, but what I says is, there's nothing like marriage. Never a cross word passes his lips, and, Mother, as all her meals with us, and he says all the better. Well, I'm that happy I simply don't know if I'm standing on my head or on my heels. But alas, it did not last too long. Sally was not so full of joy when next Liza met her, and one day her eyes looked very much as if she had been crying. "What's the matter?" asked Liza, looking at her. "What have you been blubbering about?" "Me?" said Sally, getting very red. "Oh, I've got a bit of a toothache and, well, I'm rather a fool like, and it hurts so much that I couldn't help crying." Liza was not satisfied, but could get nothing further out of her. Then one day it came out. It was a Saturday night, the time when women in Vere Street weep. Liza went up into Sally's room for a few minutes on her way to the Westminster Bridge Road, where she was to meet Jim. Harry had taken the top back room, and Liza, climbing up the second flight of stairs, called out as usual, "What ho, Sally!" The door remained shut, although Liza could see that there was a light in the room, but on getting to the door she stood still, for she heard the sound of sobbing. She listened for a minute and then knocked. There was a little flurry inside, and someone called out, "Oh, who's there?" "Only me," said Liza, opening the door. As she did so, she saw Sally rapidly wipe her eyes and put her handkerchief away. Her mother was sitting by her side, evidently comforting her. "What's up, Sal?" asked Liza. "Nothing," answered Sally, with a brave little gasp to stop the crying, turning her face downwards so that Liza should not see the tears in her eyes. But they were too strong for her, and quickly taking out her handkerchief, she hid her face in it and began to sob broken-heartedly. Liza looked at the mother in interrogation. "Oh, it's that man again," said the lady, snorting and tossing her head. "Not Harry?" asked Liza in surprise. "Not Harry? Who is it if it ain't Harry? The villain." "What's he been doing then?" asked Liza again. "Beating her, that's what he's been doing. Oh, the villain, he ought to be ashamed of hisself, he ought." "I didn't know he was like that," said Liza. "Didn't you? I thought the old street knew it by now," said Mrs. Cooper indignantly. "Oh, he's a wrong un, he is." "It wasn't his fault," put in Sally amidst her sobs. "It's only because he's had a little drop too much. He's a right when he's sober. A little drop too much. I should just think he'd add, the beast. I'd give it him if I was a man. They're all like that. Usbines is all alike. They're a right when they're sober sometimes, but when they've got the liquor in 'em, they're beasts, and no mistake. I had a usbine myself for 25 years, and I know 'em." "Well, mother," sobbed Sally, "it was all my fault. I should have come home earlier." "Nah, it wasn't your fault at all. Just you look here, Liza, this is what he'd done and call hisself a man. Just because Sally'd gone AHT to have a chat with Mrs. MacLeod in the next house, when she come in, he start banging her about. And me too, what do you think of that?" Mrs. Cooper was quite purple with indignation. "Yus," she went on, "that's a man for you. Of course I wasn't going to stand there and see my daughter being knocked about. It wasn't likely, was it? And he rounds on me and he hits me with his fist. Look here." She pulled up her sleeves and showed 2 red and brawny arms. "He's bruised my arms. I thought he'd broken it at fust. If I hadn't put my arm up, he'd have got me on the head, and he might have killed me. And I says to him, 'If you touch me again, I'll go to the police station, that I will.' Well, that frightened him a bit, and then didn't I let him have it? 'You call yourself a man,' says I, 'and you ain't fit to clean the drains AHT. You should have heard the language he used. 'You dirty old woman,' says he, 'you go away. You're always interfering with me.' Well, I don't like to repeat what he said, and that's the truth. And I says to him, 'I wish you had never married my daughter, and if I'd known you was like this, I'd have died sooner than let you.'" "Well, I didn't know he was like that," said Liza. "He was a right at fust," said Sally. "Yus, they're always a right at fust, but to think it should have come to this now, when they ain't been married 3 months, and the first child not born yet. I think it's disgraceful." Liza stayed a little while longer. helping to comfort Sally, who kept pathetically taking to herself all the blame of the dispute. And then, bidding her good night and better luck, she slid off to meet Jim. When she reached the appointed spot, he was not to be found. She waited for some time, and at last saw him come out of the neighbouring pub. "Good night, Jim," she said as she came up to him. "So you've turned up, have you?" He answered roughly, turning round. "What's the matter, Jim?" she asked in a frightened way, for he had never spoken to her in that manner. "Nice thing to keep me waiting all night for you to come AHT." She saw that he had been drinking and answered humbly, "I'm very sorry, Jim, but I went into Sally, and her bloke had been knocking her about, and so I sat with her a bit." "Knocking her about, had he? And serve her damn well right, too. And there's many more as could do with a good hiding." Liza did not answer. He looked at her, and then suddenly said, "Come in and have a drink." "Nah, I'm not thirsty. I don't want a drink," she answered. "Come on," he said angrily. "Nah, Jim, you've had quite enough already." "Who are you talking to?" he said. "Don't come if you don't want to. I'll go and have one by myself." "Nah, Jim, don't." She caught hold of his arm. "Yes, I shall," he said, going towards the pub, while she held him back. "Let me go, can't you? Let me go." He roughly pulled his arm away from her. As she tried to catch hold of it again, he pushed her back, and in the little scuffle caught her a blow over the face. "Oh," she cried, "you did hurt." He was sobered at once. "Liza," he said, "I ain't hurt you." She didn't answer, and he took her in his arms. "Liza, I ain't hurt you, have I? Say I ain't hurt you. I'm so sorry. I beg your pardon, Liza." "All right, old chap," she said, smiling charmingly on him. "It wasn't the blow that hurt me much. It was the why you was talking." "I didn't mean it, Liza." He was so contrite. He could not humble himself enough. "I had another bloomin' row with the missus tonight, and then when I didn't find you here, and I kept wittin' and wittin', well, I fair downright lost my air, and I had 2 or 3 pints of 4 Alf, and, well, I dunno." "Never mind, old cock. I can stand more than that as long as you loves me." He kissed her, and they were quite friends again. But the little quarrel had another effect which was worse for Liza. When she woke up next morning, she noticed a slight soreness over the ridge of bone under the left eye, and on looking in the glass, saw that it was black and blue and green. She bathed it, but it remained, and seemed to get more marked. She was terrified lest people should see it, and kept indoors all day. But next morning it was blacker than ever. She went to the factory with her hat over her eyes and her head bent down. She escaped observation. But on the way home, she was not so lucky. The sharp eyes of some girls noticed it first. "What's the matter with your eye?" asked one of them. "Me?" answered Liza, putting her hand up as if in ignorance. "Nothing that I knows of." 2 or 3 young men were standing by, and hearing the girl, looked up. "Why, you've got a black eye, Liza." "Me? I ain't got no black eye." "Yes, you have." "How'd you get it?" "I dunno," said Liza. "I didn't know I had one." "Garn, tell us another," was the answer. "One doesn't get a black eye without knowing how they got it." "Well, I did fall against the chest of drawers yesterday. I suppose I must have got it then." "Oh, yes, we believe that, don't we?" "I didn't know he was so handy with his dukes, did you, Ted?" asked one man of another. Liza felt herself grow red to the tips of her toes. "Who?" she asked. "Never you mind, nobody you know." At that moment, Jim's wife passed, and looked at her with a scowl. Liza wished herself 100 miles away, and blushed more violently than ever. "What are ye blushing about?" ingenuously asked one of the girls, and they all looked from her to Mrs. Blakeston and back again. Someone said, "How about our Sunday boots on now?" And a titter went through them, Liza's nerve deserted her. She could think of nothing to say, and a sob burst from her. To hide the tears which were coming from her eyes, she turned away and walked homewards. Immediately, a great shout of laughter broke from the group, and she heard them positively screaming till she got into her own house. 11. A few days afterwards, Liza was talking with Sally, who did not seem very much happier than when Liza had last seen her. "He ain't what I thought he was," she said. "I don't mind saying that, but he has a lot to put up with. I expect I'm rather trying sometimes, and he means well. Perhaps he'll be kinder like when the baby's born." "Cheer up, old gal," answered Liza, who had seen something of the lives of many married couples. "It won't seem so bad after yer gets used to it. It's a bit disappointing at fust, but yer gets not to mind it." After a little, Sally said she must go and see about her husband's tea. She said goodbye, and then rather awkwardly, "Say, Liza, take care of yourself." "Take care of myself? Why?" asked Liza in surprise. "You know what I mean." "Nah, I'm darned if I do." "That there Mrs. Blakeston, she's looking AHT for you." "Mrs. Blakeston?" Liza was startled. "Yes, she says she's going to give you something if she can get hold on you. I should advise you to take care." "Me?" said Liza. Sally looked away so as not to see the other's face. "She says as how you've been messing about with her old man." Liza didn't say anything, and Sally, repeating her goodbye, slid off. Liza felt a chill run through her. She had several times noticed a scowl and a look of anger on Mrs. Blakeston's face, and she had avoided her as much as possible. But she had no idea that the woman meant to do anything to her. She was very frightened. A cold sweat broke out over her face. If Mrs. Blakeston got hold of her, she would be helpless. She was so small and weak, while the other was strong and muscular. Liza wondered what she would do if she did catch her. That night she told Jim and tried to make a joke of it. "I say, Jim, your missus, she says she's going to give me socks if she catches me." "My missus? How do you know?" "She's been telling people in the street." "Go lummy," said Jim, furious. "If she dares to touch a hair of your head, swap me dicky, I'll give her sich a hiding as she never had before. By God, give me the chance, and I would let her have it. I'm bloomin' well sick of her sulks." He clenched his fist as he spoke. Liza was a coward. She could not help thinking of her enemy's threat. It got on her nerves, and she hardly dared go out for fear of meeting her. She would look nervously in front of her, quickly turning round if she saw in the distance anyone resembling Mrs. Blakeston. She dreamed of her at night. She saw the big, powerful form, the heavy, frowning face, and the curiously braided brown hair, and she would wake up with a cry and find herself bathed in sweat. It was the Saturday afternoon following this, a chill November day, with the roads sloshy and a grey, comfortless sky that made one's spirits sink. It was about 3 o'clock, and Liza was coming home from work. She got into Vere Street and was walking quickly towards her house when she saw Mrs. Blakeston coming towards her. Her heart gave a great jump. Turning, she walked rapidly in the direction she had come. With a screw round of her eyes, she saw that she was being followed, and therefore went straight out of Vere Street. She went right round, meaning to get into the street from the other end, and unobserved slip into her house, which was then quite close. But she dared not risk it immediately for fear Mrs. Blakeston should still be there, so she waited about for half an hour. It seemed an age. Finally, taking her courage in both hands, she turned the corner and entered Vere Street. She nearly ran into the arms of Mrs. Blakeston, who was standing close to the public-house door. Liza gave a little cry, and the woman said with a sneer, "You didn't expect to see me, did you?" Liza did not answer, but tried to walk past her. Mrs. Blakeston stepped forward and blocked her way. "You seem to be in a mighty fine hurry," she said. "Yes, I've got to get home," said Liza, again trying to pass. "But supposing I don't let you," remarked Mrs. Blakeston, preventing her from moving. "Why don't you leave me alone?" Liza said. I ain't interfering with you. Not interfering with me, aren't you? I like that. Let me go by, said Liza. I don't want to talk to you. Nah, I know that, said the other. But I want to talk to you, and I shan't let you go until I've said what I wants to say. Liza looked round for help. At the beginning of the altercation, the loafers about the public house had looked up with interest and gradually gathered round in a little circle. Passers-by had joined in, and a number of other people in the street, seeing the crowd, added themselves to it to see what was going on. Liza saw that all eyes were fixed on her, the men amused and excited, the women unsympathetic, rather virtuously indignant. Liza wanted to ask for help, but there were so many people, and they all seemed so much against her that she had not the courage to. So, having surveyed the crowd, she turned her eyes to Mrs. Blakeston and stood in front of her, trembling a little and very white. Nah, he ain't there, said Mrs. Blakeston sneeringly, so you needn't look for him. I don't know what you mean, answered Liza, and I want to go away. I ain't done nothing to you. Not done nothing to me, furiously repeated the woman. I'll tell you what you've done to me. You've robbed me of my husband, you have. I never had a word with my husband until you took him from me, and now it's all you with him. He's got no time for his wife and family. It's all you, and his money too. I never get a penny of it. If it weren't for the little bit I had saved up in the saving bank, me and my children, you'd be starving now, and all through you. She shook her fist at her. I never had any money from anyone. Don't talk to me. I know you did. You dirty bitch. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, taking a married man from his family, and him old enough to be your father. She's right there, said one or two of the onlooking women. There can't be no good in her if she takes somebody else's husband. I'll give it ye, proceeded Mrs. Blakeston, getting more hot and excited, brandishing her fist and speaking in a loud voice, hoarse with rage. Oh, I've been trying to get hold on you this 4 weeks. Why, you're a prostitute. That's what you are. I'm not, answered Liza indignantly. Yes, you are, repeated Mrs. Blakeston, advancing menacingly so that Liza shrank back. And what's more, he treats you like one. I know who give you that black eye, that shows what he thinks of you, and serve you bloomin' well right if he'd give you one in both eyes. Mrs. Blakeston stood close in front of her, her heavy jaw protruded, and the frown of her eyebrows dark and stern. For a moment she stood silent, contemplating Liza, while the surrounders looked on in breathless interest. You dirty little bitch, you, she said at last. Take that. And with her open hand she gave her a sharp smack on the cheek. Liza started back with a cry and put her hand up to her face. And take that, added Mrs. Blakeston, repeating the blow. Then, gathering up the spittle in her mouth, she spat in Liza's face. Liza sprang on her, and with her hands spread out like claws, buried her nails in the woman's face and drew them down her cheeks. Mrs. Blakeston caught hold of her hair with both hands and tugged at it as hard as she could. But they were immediately separated. Here, old Ard, said some of the men. Fight at HT fair and square. Don't go scratching and mauling like that. I'll fight her, I don't mind, shouted Mrs. Blakeston, tucking up her sleeves and savagely glaring at her opponent. Liza stood in front of her, pale and trembling. As she looked at her enemy and saw the long red marks of her nails, with blood coming from one or two of them, she shrank back. I don't want to fight, she said hoarsely. Nah, I don't suppose you do, hissed the other, but you'll damn well have to. She's ever so much bigger than me. I've got no chance, added Liza tearfully. You should have thought of that before. Come on. And with these words, Mrs. Blakeston rushed upon her. She hit her with both fists, one after the other. Liza did not try to guard herself, but imitating the woman's motion, hit out with her own fists, and for a minute or two they continued thus, raining blows on one another with the same windmill motion of the arms. But Liza could not stand against the other woman's weight. The blows came down heavy and rapid all over her face and head. She put up her hands to cover her face and turned her head away, while Mrs. Blakeston kept on hitting mercilessly. "Time!" shouted some of the men. "Time!" And Mrs. Blakeston stopped to rest herself. "It don't seem hardly fair to set them two on together. Liza's got no chance against a big woman like that," said a man among the crowd. "Well, it's her own fault," answered a woman. "She didn't ought to mess about with her husband." "Well, I don't think it's right," added another man. "She's getting it too much." "And serve her right too," said one of the women. "She deserves all she gets, and a damn sight more into the bargain." "Quite right," put in a third. "A woman's got no right to take someone's husband from her, and if she does, she's bloomin' lucky if she gets off with a hidin'. That's what I think." "So do I. But I wouldn't have thought it of Liza. I never thought she was a wrong un." "Pretty specimen she is," said a little dark woman who looked like a Jewess. "If she messed about with my old man, I'd stick her. I swear I would. Now she's been carrying on with one, she'll try and get others. You see if she don't. She'd better not come round my house. I'll soon give her what for." Meanwhile, Liza was standing at one corner of the ring, trembling all over and crying bitterly. One of her eyes was bunged up, and her hair, all dishevelled, was hanging down over her face. Two young fellows, who had constituted themselves her seconds, were standing in front of her, offering rather ironical comfort. One of them had taken the bottom corners of her apron and was fanning her with it, while the other was showing her how to stand and hold her arms. "You stand up to her, Liza," he was saying. "There ain't no good funk in it. You'll simply get it all the worse. You hit her back. Give her one on the boko like this. See, you must show a bit of pluck, you know." Liza tried to check her sobs. "Use hit her hard. That's what you've got to do," said the other. "And if you find she's getting the better on you, you close on her and catch hold of her hair and scratch her. You've marked her with your nails, Liza. By gosh, you did fly on her when she spat at you. That's the way to do the job." Then turning to his fellow, he said, "Do you remember that fighter's old mother Craig had with another woman in the street last year?" "Nah," he answered. "I never saw that. It was a corker, and the cops come in and took 'em both off to quad." Liza wished the policeman would come and take her off. She would willingly have gone to prison to escape the fiend in front of her, but no help came. "Time's up!" shouted the referee. "Fire away!" "Take care of the cops!" shouted a man. "There's no fear about them," answered somebody else. "They always keeps out of the way when there's anything going on. Fire away!" Mrs. Blakeston attacked Liza madly, but the girl stood up bravely and, as well as she could, gave back the blows she received. The spectators grew tremendously excited. "Got him again," they shouted. "Give it her, Liza, that's a good un. It a hard." "2-1 on the old un," shouted a sporting gentleman, but Liza found no backers. "Ain't she standing up well now she's roused?" cried someone. "Oh, she's got some pluck in her, she has." "That's a knockout," they shouted as Mrs. Blakeston brought her fist down onto Liza's nose. The girl staggered back and blood began to flow. Then, losing all fear, mad with rage, she made a rush on her enemy and rained down blows all over her nose and eyes and mouth. The woman recoiled at the sudden violence of the onslaught, and the men cried, "By God, the little un's getting the best of it." But quickly recovering herself, the woman closed with Liza and dug her nails into her flesh. Liza caught hold of her hair and pulled with all her might, and turning her teeth on Mrs. Blakeston tried to bite her. And thus for a minute they swayed about, scratching, tearing, biting, sweat and blood pouring down their faces, and their eyes fixed on one another, bloodshot and full of rage. The audience shouted and cheered and clapped their hands. "What the hell's up here?" "I see. Look there," said some of the women in a whisper. "It's the Usbind." He stood on tiptoe and looked over the crowd. "My God," he said, "it's Liza." Then, roughly pushing the people aside, he made his way through the crowd into the center and, thrusting himself between the two women, tore them apart. He turned furiously on his wife. "By God, I'll give you something for this." And for a moment, they all three stood silently looking at one another. Another man had been attracted by the crowd, and he too pushed his way through. "Come home, Liza," he said. "Tom." He took hold of her arm and led her through the people who gave way to let her pass. They walked silently through the street, Tom very grave, Liza weeping bitterly. "Oh, Tom," she sobbed after a while. "I couldn't help it. Then, when her tears permitted, I did love him so." When they got to the door, she plaintively said, "Come in," and he followed her to her room. Here she sank onto a chair and gave herself up to her tears. Tom wetted the end of a towel and began wiping her face, grimy with blood and tears. She let him do it, just moaning amid her sobs. "You are good to me, Tom." "Cheer up, old gal," he said kindly. "It's all over now." After a while, the excess of crying brought its cessation. She drank some water, and then taking up a broken hand-glass, she looked at herself, saying, "I am a sight," and proceeded to wind up her hair. "You have been good to me, Tom," she repeated, her voice still broken with sobs, and as he sat down beside her, she took his hand. "Nah, I ain't," he answered. "It's only what anybody you have done." "You know, Tom," she said, after a little silence, "I'm so sorry I spoke cross, like when I met you in the street. You ain't spoke to me since." "Oh, that's all over now, old Liddy. We needn't think of that." "Oh, but I have treated you bad. I'm a regular wrong un, I am." He pressed her hand without speaking. "I say, Tom," she began, after another pause. "Did you know that, well, you know, before day?" He blushed as he answered, "Use." She spoke very sadly and slowly. "I thought you did. You seemed so cut up like when I used to meet you. You did love me then, Tom, didn't you?" "I do now, dearie," he answered. "Ah, it's too late now," she sighed. "Do you know, Liza," he said, "I just about kicked the life aht of a fella 'cause he said you was messing about with him. And you knew I was?" "Yes, but I wasn't going to have anyone say it before me. They've all rounded on me except you, Tom. I'd have done better if I'd taken you when you asked me. I shouldn't be where I am now if I had." "Well, won't you now? Won't you have me now? Me? After what's happened?" "Oh, I don't mind about that. That don't matter to me if you'll marry me. I fair can't live without you, Liza, won't you?" She groaned. "Nah, I can't, Tom. It wouldn't be right." "Why not, if I don't mind?"